Hello there, just a very quick introduction of this video series from me. I'm Neha and I'm working with the Educational Incubators Decolonial Knowledge Production and Anti-Racist Pedagogies project. This is the first part of an In Conversation panel series throughout this year for taught students across the English and film departments, which looks to speak to taught alumni about decolonizing as a methodology in their own research. This aims to encourage and enable you to look at yourselves as researchers in your own right when approaching your written work or your dissertations. We're aiming to have 5 to 6 of these panels, which will be shared across to you by the SSLC, the subject chair, or the decolonizing network. Here you will see students in conversation with each other about decolonial research methods. We'll be approaching this temporally and thematically. And at the end of this video, I'll talk a bit more about the sessions we have coming up. Again, if you're interested in hosting or taking part in this series, please do email myself, the SSLC, or the Exeter Decolonizing Network. I'll put the emails down there. To start us off today, we have Fatima Naveed, who is currently a PGR at Exeter, working on a literary history of the Progressive Writers Association. She also did her undergraduate degree here with a fantastic dissertation on women's voices in partition. She was looking at the documentary processes in works of Ati Hussain, Anita Desai, and Bapsi Sidhwa. Fatima engaged with archival sources in interviews, as well as close analysis of South Asian literary and theoretical texts. I'll let her introduce herself in a minute, of course, but we'll be talking to her today about the issues around assumptions of subalternity when it comes to postcolonial and South Asian literature. Her experience working on writing that is very closely connected to current global conflict, as well as her takes on the importance and how to approach oral history as a literary source.
So I did my undergrad in English at Exeter in 2018. And I mostly, by my third year, I was focusing on primarily South Asian literature. So I did acts of writing, and my dissertation was on partition literature, but specifically women's writing on partition. And I sort of looked at how fictional works and at the same time archival works, such as interviews that have been conducted with partition survivors, how they sort of fed into each other. So where fiction was being inspired by the archive, and where in most cases we could connect the archive as a text and sort of link it to other fictional works. So I did 3 female authors, and their writing, it's very much women's writing in the sense that they're women-centric stories, but it was partition literature primarily. So yeah, that was in a nutshell, that was my focus as a taught student.
So I guess when you say you focused on women's writing in a partition context, am I right to say you approached it, or at least you started thinking about it through the lens of subaltern theory, where, and just a quick intro, where a lot of postcolonial and literary and historical approaches engage with subalternity, where the term acknowledges subjugation, as well as relies on the recognition that there are and have always been an alternate series of voices. So I guess what I wanted to ask you with your work around women's literature was just tell us more about working with subalternity. Is it an assumption, and who do you think decides who subalternity is bestowed upon, or do you approach it more as a theory?
Okay, so with subalternity, I think primarily the number one sort of theorist name that you think of is always Spivak. And not my problem with theory, but my problem in general with things like, concepts like subalternity and how they sort of turn into, for some reason, grand narratives that people think can encapsulate sort of third world experiences in a nutshell. So my problem with that is mostly that the very much Western canon of theory, and by Western I mean theory that is being produced in the West, whether or not it is based off of experiences of people in the global South, I think it can be quite restricting. I think it's necessary to understand it. So I certainly read Spivak, and I had been taught Spivak twice when I was a taught student. So I think it's necessary to understand it, to engage with it. But I think that is necessary because it's only once you've engaged with it that you understand how you can argue against it or go against it or point out the places where there are gaps in it, and then fill in the gaps yourself. And it's not necessary to fill in gaps with other theorists. Sometimes you can fill in gaps with something like oral history, or you can fill in gaps with something like close reading or etc. You need to keep three main things in mind when you're thinking about theory, specifically when you're working on world literature, when you're working on women's writing, when you're working on South Asian studies. It's who is speaking, who are they speaking to, and what are they speaking about. So it's necessary, again, you need to deal with theory not just as theory, but you can close read the theory as well. You can close read the identity of the theorist as well. And I think that's something I very much did, because I certainly referred to subaltern studies when I did my dissertation, but I did not center it on that. Mine was very much centric on close reading and oral history, for the simple reason that I found that there were gaps in it that at the time I didn't think I was qualified enough to try and fill. And also at the time that I didn't see why I needed to necessarily engage with that in order to get my point across. So I think that's a decision that you also need to take when you're dealing with theory, where sometimes you need to know it, you need to understand it. And in that understanding, sometimes you realize I don't necessarily need to dive headfirst into it and, center my entire research around it. That context as well.
So did you work with a lot of material published outside the UK then? Did you work with interviews or perhaps accounts published in South Asia, both in your undergraduate and right now?
You just answered your own question. I did, because what I found with my undergrad research, what I found was that because I wanted to look at women's voices, because I went quite, not niche, but I went quite specific. So I wanted women's voices, I wanted partition survivors, partition witnesses, and I wanted South Asian voices from South Asia. So I wanted people who had migrated across the Radcliffe line, basically. And that's specifically what I wanted to look at. And with regards to that, I was very lucky that what I wanted, I found with social workers and with scholars who had worked with women who had witnessed partition, who had survived, and who had gone on to do social work themselves as well. So I was lucky in that sense. Most of the interviews I looked at had all been produced and published and done in South Asia.
I'm just gonna take you back to what you were saying just a while ago about you approaching Spivak, but I think what you touched on that I really wanted to engage with you further on is not just how you approached Spivak, but how you thought Spivak herself approached these texts. So institutionally, us at Exeter and UK academia in general, I would say there's almost an obsession with breaking from the West and embracing the global, the latitudinal. And as a researcher, I guess, not just as an undergraduate student doing their dissertation or as a PGR, as a researcher, you would have to decide whether your primary concern is yourself as an individual approaching from X or Y direction, or your university adopting a, and I quote, globalized, diversified approach. Whether you as a researcher, instead of prioritizing these individualized or institutionalized directives, whether you prioritize the archives with its respective omissions, crossing outs, and personally, so I would say I think that the focus needs to be less on a researcher constantly querying where they're coming from, and instead on what these transactional, transnational relationships are and were doing to texts, your relationship to the texts and previous reading of the texts. So I guess regarding the archive and what you said about approaching from east or west, and in terms of learning the rules to break the rules, would you say you, I guess, agree with the Dipesh Chakravarty's standpoint, where you say that breaking from the Western narrative as a researcher is, or completely breaking away is impossible? Or would you take on a more Slovakian approach of approaching deconstructively, and reading backwards and reading against?
I think that the answer to a lot of questions that sort of talk about this is always A, you need to balance, and B, it needs to be a little bit of both. I don't think you can disregard the identity of the theorist and of the author or of anyone like that. I also don't think you can disregard your own identity, your own inherent biases, and your own inherent privilege or lack of privilege in certain cases. So I think that it needs to be balanced. It's not easy at all. I think in a lot of ways, a lot of us wish that we were doing things differently and researching in different ways, using different methods, but we are restricted by the institution that we're aligned with, by where we are located geographically, by the languages that we have access to or some that we don't have access to. And I think that there are ways to navigate those restrictions where you can still make a contribution to whatever field you're in. And I think that people should absolutely do that. But I also think that I definitely think that there's room for decentering, there's room for destabilizing. I also think that there's definitely room for interrogating, and I don't want to say that you should, but I do want to say you can operate within the confines that you have, specifically with regard to, I think, world literature. I think that, when issues of translation come up, I think when issues of, particularly with oral history, when issues of ethics come up, when issues of, cultural understanding and all of those things, when those things start to come up, you need to be able to find a balance. Otherwise, you'll drive yourself crazy. And the contribution you make won't make sense at the end of the day. I think that, there's a fine balance between interrogating yourself, your own position, and the other person's position in order to come to, a kind of conclusion, versus just consistently interrogating and going in an endless cycle of questions and questions. And at the end of the day, I don't think that contributes as much as, you need to come to some kind of conclusion. You need to draw some answers. And I think that there are ways to do that employ both tactics, that you don't have to pick one or the other. And I think that, again, like you said, you need to know the rules to break the rules. So I think that you really need to, and I think especially at this stage, when you're in a taught degree, learn all the rules by all means. I mean, I was never the best person at theory, but I took theory modules for all 3 years because I knew that I needed to understand what was it about it that made me really angry and that annoyed me. I knew that if I didn't, you can't argue with someone about Derrida or Foucault if you don't know who they are or what they stand for. And that's, of course, I feel like, scholars of world literature specifically need to be slightly overqualified for everything they do, because we do get questioned quite a bit on our standpoint, on what our biases are, on whether or not we have critical distance and etc. So again, my answer to this is always balance, but please know both sides really, really well, because you will get interrogated and you will get questioned, and you will not be taken seriously otherwise. That's such a pessimistic thing to say. I'm so sorry.
No. Give me more pessimism. That's exactly what we need in this year. So you worked a lot when going back to the specifics of your undergraduate dissertation. From what I can remember, I know you worked a lot around the structure, disruption, and personification of the household, where you extrapolated personal narratives outward into the larger political tragedy. And I guess it's very important to remember, as in your case, in the case of your dissertation, you were examining and interrogating something in a literary manner that still has political consequences to this day, that still has personal consequences to this day. And I guess what role do you think oral history and your use of interviews that with people who are either acquainted to yourself or that you found in the present day that are affected by these narratives from decades ago, what importance do you think comes from your seeking out of these oral narratives?
So I think that because my research was so specific to South Asia and specifically to partition, because I was looking at partition narratives, I think, home, households, belonging, displacement are important ideas, whether literature, geography, anything specifically with partition. These are, themes and motifs that keep coming up again and again. But this was actually something that I learned not through theory or literature, but it was something I learned just through talking to people I was related to or I was, acquainted with, as you said. So, again, there was there was a personal investment in it, perhaps not a bias, but there was definitely a personal investment. And that's where I started noticing that a lot of this stuff was coming out of South Asia. It was published in South Asia by people who lived in India or Pakistan or Bangladesh. And it was a lot of stuff that, perhaps, again, I don't want to confine something by calling it mainstream, ironically enough, but I do want to say that, this was stuff that it took digging to find. It was not, it wasn't a Google search or a Google Scholar search and something showed up like this. It took a while to find this stuff. And I think that was because even though it was all written in English, even though it was published by relatively large publishing houses, but it was based out of India or it was based out of Pakistan. And yeah.
So I'm just going to pick your brains a bit more about the archive, and you mentioned the digging that it took and the efforts that researchers make to find these archives, to locate these narratives. What about when you're then confronted with silence? What about when you are confronted with omissions, be it an unwillingness to speak in regards to oral history, or straight up crossing out, like in Operation Legacy? What do you do with these silences? Because do you fill them in? Do you interpret the silence, or do you let the silence speak for itself?
So it's a tricky thing, and I've seen it. I've sort of borderline encountered it in certain spaces where I've read oral history accounts where it's very clear that there have been omissions. And the thing is, how do you know that something has been omitted? Something has been omitted when you're conducting an interview because you know what the history is. You know the history, the literature, the geography, the theory. So I think one of the things that you have to do is you have to have all the background information so that when you're conducting an interview, the person who's doing, if they, name drop a name or a place or something, your brain immediately understands what they're referring to. And I think in certain cases, when silences and when omissions are made, you can immediately, there are certain things that you can just fill in yourself. If there is a monumental event in history that is happening at the, and the person is narrating a story from their life at the time, you can tell through expressions and through the words that they use, are they omitting this detail on purpose because they don't want to talk about it, or are they, were they genuinely not aware of what was going on outside of, their home and stuff? And that is then another angle that you look at, that, were there actually people who were not aware of what was going on? Were they not aware of, what was happening in 1947? Because there are people who were like that. So I think that is definitely one really interesting thing. I think the other thing is, there's an ethical side to it as well. You certainly can't fill in silences as fact. You certainly can't say that, this person has not talked about X because Y was happening. That is not, I know that we're taught not to have a passive voice and we're taught to be quite clear cut with our research, but I think that is one thing that you need to be very careful of.
I guess finally, I'm going to take the specifics of your project and onto your subject area, onto what you're working with South Asian literature, and you mentioned towards the start of this conversation that you are very conscious as to where people are sitting and where people are coming from when they say these things, and you have a really good point there, because I guess our efforts at decolonizing our own research, our efforts at teaching, praxis, procedures, where you have to think where they're coming from, and I guess, can you do a project on the ill effects of the British military rule when you have armies recruiting on your campus? And I think one of those things that you pointed out was the impact of the Western academic institution on a lot of theory and literature that is produced. So when you look at a lot of post-colonial big names, when you look at a lot of post-colonial big names such as Spivak, or even not just in theory but also in literature, a lot of them are, it can't be avoided, a lot of them are situated outside South Asia. A lot of them are in the UK or the US. So how do you think a dissertation looking at world literature can navigate the tricky, often interrelations between diaspora, homeland, and the in-between trajectories without disregarding them completely?
So I think that, and this is something that it goes back to what I was talking about, privilege and biases. I think this is something that you really need to confront head on. And I think not just the researcher who's working on this, but the theorists and the writers themselves really need to confront this head on. I think some do. I don't think some do it enough, which is my problem with it. And you can, I mean, when you read theory, you don't need me to say names. We all know who I'm talking about. I think, yeah, as I've said, the identity of your theorist and your writer in literature or in history or in theory or anything else matters just as much as the close reading you're doing. Because if you're not interrogating the place and the positionality of who has written what you're analyzing, then there's a gap in your analysis. I think that when we write essays, even as taught students, I think your experiences and your personal opinions feed so much into what you're writing that I think you're doing a disservice to a dissertation if you try to be, quote unquote, critically distanced or quote unquote neutral, to an excessive amount. I think that I don't think that is good academic writing. I think the best kind of academic writing is the one in which you are able to make a standpoint after understanding both sides. But again, interrogating the positionality of the theorist or a writer is not disrespectful in any way. It's rather, you're picking out things that sometimes even the writer or the theorist is not aware about, and a good writer and a good theorist that. Again, most don't. So yeah, and I think obviously because and I know you said that take a step back and look at South Asian studies as a whole, but especially when you look at partition, disconnect, displacement, belonging, homeland, there's such important ideas in partition literature certainly, but in South Asian studies as well. So I think that I think another thing with regard to that you really need to understand is, whether it's, someone who is from the diaspora, whether it's someone from the homeland, or, someone who's in between. I think it's important to say that because not all experiences are homogenous, certainly not the experiences of all diaspora, everyone in the homeland. There's class that plays into it, there's privilege that plays into it, there's, as I said, there's language that plays into it. I think that there's no experience that is good or bad that makes you uniquely qualified to give an opinion or to write an academic piece or anything like that. I think that privilege will exist in all these forms of identity in different ways, whether you're based in the West, whether you're based in the global South, wherever you are. But I think that what's important is always to interrogate that privilege, your own and also the privilege of whoever you're writing about. To put writers and theorists up on a pedestal does no one any good, because then the pedestal will break and they will fall and the bus will crash onto the ground and you will be left weeping, surrounded by the shards of your academic career, which you built up based on one person. And once that person, inevitably falls down, you're whatever. So yeah, I think that interrogating the privilege is important, especially if the person that you're interrogating doesn't do so themselves. That's just one more unique thing you're adding to the literary canon, so to speak. But yeah, different experiences are not bad experiences, they're just different. And if anything, that just gives you more fodder for writing and for analysis. So definitely, take what you can get.
Thank you. No, that I think interrogating positionality and not putting either theory or literature on a pedestal is incredibly important to remember as a researcher, especially when you're coming from a. So I'm talking about the British education system, of course, especially when you're coming from a schooling background where your relationship with the text is obviously that of the text, the theory, but then myself, and you've really managed to disrupt that hierarchy, I'd say. And I think one more really important thing that you said is the fact that you cannot mitigate something that you cannot understand, that you have to learn the rules before you break the rules. But obviously the goal is always to break the rules. Thank you so much. And
you're welcome. Happy to be here.
So that was a very enlightening session we just had with Fatima. She really hit the nail on the head with her position that the archive, oral, literary, or historical, is a resource that can and should be engaged with as a taught student. In working with South Asian literature, there are some really useful records in the British Library, and it's also worth speaking to researchers closer to home, such as those based in Exeter's South Asia Centre. Something to note is that this conversation did not look at decolonization as a perfunctory checklist, but rather a constant endeavour and series of conscious encounters with texts, theory, and people. As such, it's important to remember that decolonizing your research is not a box to check, nor is it any key to any sort of intimation of a global academy. It is instead a process of engagement with literature and cinema, but it is also a reflexive, disruptive mode of reading any text wherever or whenever they are situated. As such, here are some of the other sessions and speakers we will be looking to engage with across the term. Looking at not just contemporary world literature and cinema, but also to situate these decolonial methods in other time periods. It's a process of cognizance and consciousness of disrupting the idea that only X or Y time periods need to be, decolonized. We really hope you enjoyed and will continue to enjoy this video series. And as I said previously, please do contact us if you are either a current student looking to host these sessions and take part in these conversations like I did today, or if you're an alumni who had approached these themes in your own work previously. Thank you so much, and I hope that was as interesting for you as it was for me.